In flow, all of the brain's information processing machinery is massively amplified for a variety of neurobiological reasons. We take in more information per second, we process it more completely and process it more deeply. And as a result, we see all kinds of upticks in performance and motivation and productivity and creativity and innovation and learning rates. All the things you need to keep pace in an accelerated world show up in flow.
Welcome to the Worth the Fight podcast, where we bring you powerful conversations surrounding the sensible and therapeutic use of psychedelics and plant medicines towards healing trauma. I'll introduce you to guests who, through their own personal journey and transformation, tell the Worth the Fight story. I'm your host, Matt Simpson, author of Worth the Fight, Acting for a Better World, a guide to spirituality, psychedelic medicines, and overcoming trauma. Thank you for listening. My next guest on the Worth the Fight podcast is a true hero of mine. An author, a science journalist, a futurist, a self-proclaimed flow junkie, a brilliant man doing incredible work for our human family, a world-renowned flow researcher and peak performance expert, Stephen Kotler. Stephen has 8 bestsellers to his credit and has been nominated for 2 Pulitzer Prizes, A Small Furry Prayer, and my favorite book of all time, Stealing Fire. Please enjoy our inspired conversation digging into Stephen's latest project, Mapping Cloud 9, where he tells the greatest story never told as he investigates the relationship between the science of spirituality and the science of peak performance. Thank you so much for listening.
Stephen, I am unbelievably excited about Mapping Cloud 9. This is the most excited I've been about a book since the release of your book, Stealing Fire. Can you tell us about the motivation and the inspiration behind this book?
Yeah, it's funny you started with Stealing Fire because the truth of the matter was this book and this title was literally the book that became Stealing Fire. And to me, the story behind Mapping Cloud 9 is essentially the story of modern high performance, the science of modern high performance, which sort of begins in around the 1870s with the work of Friedrich Nietzsche, and with what you could call the science of spirituality, right? I often say Mapping Cloud 9 is the science of peak performance meets the science of spirituality on a dark and stormy night. And it's because these sciences started out as the exact same thing. And then they split apart wildly during the 20th century and now have come back together over the past 5 to 10 years. And I, as I was writing this book, there was the story of the fact that there was a revolution in people utilizing altered states of consciousness to up-level performance was more interesting, and especially more interesting to an audience, I think, than this kind of geekier tale of these two sciences, which almost got completely edited out from Stealing Fire. But it never sort of left me, this desire to tell that story. And I knew no publisher was really going to let me essentially rewrite West of Jesus, Rise of Superman, Stealing Fire, and parts of Bold, which is what I had to do for Mapping Cloud 9, right? Like nobody was going to let me do that. But when Sounds True came to me and said, hey, do you want to do an audiobook? Well, they didn't care. They thought it was what I thought, which was one of the greatest stories never told, and somebody should tell it. So they let me do it, and that's sort of where it came from. But it actually began as it was the foundational idea in Stealing Fire, and then it sort of became, along the way, Stealing Fire outtakes, I would guess. More from kind of my side of the equation, stuff that I was really, really geeked about. I'm sort of a history of science geek. So a lot of this is in that category, I guess.
Well, I loved it. And I think that the summary and the inspiration and the motivation, taking key points from Rise of Superman, which is another profound book that is a complete game changer, and taking points from Stealing Fire and bringing together this, I love the way that you say that the science of spirituality and the science of high performance meet on a dark and stormy night. And it's so true. And I think that a lot of people get caught up on this path. And I know from my personal experience, I had a profound moment years back where it was one of those moments with cosmic levity where I got into a fit of laughter, and I'm like, it's all the same. And I believe that it's 2 ways of talking about the same thing. And it was trusting science that led me to spirit. And then in time, realizing that it's 2 sides of the same coin.
I'm not qualified to comment on that. I don't know what anybody means by the term spirit or spirituality or anything on that side of the coin. I really don't. I know that there's a sensation that occurs when I'm in flow that people talk about as spirituality, but I don't actually know if that's, you know what I mean? That's as far as I can take it. I'm a science guy. I'm just incredibly excited. We have the tools to decode these experiences, figure out where they're coming from in the brain, why they're coming, and how we can get more of them.
I love it. I absolutely love it. I love that commitment to decoding and to mapping these upper limit states of consciousness. And I love the hopeful nature of the book and of the program.
Again, it's all, the thing, I was thinking about that. I was having this conversation with somebody about this yesterday. One of the reasons I think there's so much hope in the book is I've gotten to watch the science change, right? Like the idea that there was this kind of upper, right, science or psychology, especially in the 20th century, was Freud came along and basically, before Freud, William James was really interested in kind of these upper level, the ecstatic states, right? The upper levels of human experience. And Freud came along and said, no. Psychology is about fixing pathological problems. We're not interested in exploring psychological possibilities. And there were people who rebelled against this idea along the way. We know their names: Abraham Maslow, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, right? Like those are big names along the way who said, no, we're going to actually work on this. But it was only a handful of people. And, there's been a huge shift in the past 20 years. But what is so interesting to me, if you go back to the 90s when I started doing this work, to show you how far we come, forget about the science of mystical experiences or any of that stuff that we're actually talking about. In the 90s, you couldn't talk about emotions scientifically until 1996, when a guy named Jaak Pansep managed to map the neuron by neuron pathways of the 7 basic emotional systems in the brain. And suddenly, for the first time in 100 years, emotions were a real thing, right? And right on the heels of that came consciousness, which was another topic that you couldn't really talk about and be taken seriously as a scientist, but that changed. A lot of different people worked on that, but that one started to shift. And, with it, we got, an entirely different view of what it meant to be human, and it just unlocked all these spaces. And now you just have so many people, so many countries working on this stuff. It doesn't seem like it's going to stop. Seems like there's a lot of cause for hope.
Absolutely. I want to unpack the mention of Freud. He was, if I remember correctly from Mapping Cloud 9, he's set off the 100-year detour, correct?
He did with that very pronouncement. He also, it was both that psychology should focus on pathological possibilities, and also, William James was very, let's just say, spiritually open-minded. Right? Very, very curious. In fact, in something that we think of as almost nonsensical today, he spent most of his adult life trying to prove that mediums were a real thing. Never to his satisfaction. He was but he remained massively open-minded to all kinds of spiritual phenomenon. And Freud came along and said, no. Mommy and culture way too much, and spirituality is just, it's nonsense, it's evolutionary baggage, it's not useful, and we shouldn't pay any attention to it. And so those two things, right, were the beginning of the end. Behaviorism came next, which became the dominant thinking in psychology, and behaviorism said emotions, everything that happens in the brain is essentially a black box, including emotions, right? So that's where all that went away. And if you can't get at emotions, you can't start getting at these upper possibilities in human experience, because one of their defining characteristics is how good they make us feel. And underneath that feeling is, a lot of reward neurochemistry that, has helped us understand where those feelings come from. But if you can't open that box at all, you can't get access to any of this stuff.
Yes. And the flow research that you're doing at the Flow Research Collective is really mapping those emotions and is mapping, correct? Well,
as of right now, we have 10 different ongoing research projects, and they're really across the board. Our big goal is to decode the neurobiology of flow. So that's really where most of our efforts are going. But we're partnered, for example, with Glenn Fox at USC And he's a neuroscientist who's an expert in gratitude. And we've got a year-long research project looking at gratitude and flow and all that stuff. We've got a research project ongoing with UCLA and Ojai Energetics, where we're looking at the relationship between anandamide and the endocannabinoid system, and specifically CBD and THC and their relationship to flow. We're doing some of that work. We've got some work going on. What else is going on that's really kind of exciting and interesting to me? I think the most exciting thing is work that we're doing with Andrew Huberman at Stanford. This is the most fun for me. Flow is such a massively complicated process in the brain that to get a better handle on it, I started thinking about, for a lot of different reasons, I started thinking about, well, could we map what happens in the brain during the first 2 seconds of flow? Forget the whole experience, which is 90 minutes to 120 minutes, depending, right? Usually. And then there are versions that can stretch for days, but mostly it's 90 to 120 minutes. We just want to know what happens in the brain during the first 2 seconds of flow, just to get a toehold on the experience. And we are getting very close. We're working on an article right now on what we're calling the neural circuit for flow. And we think we've got a pretty good map of literally what happens in the brain for the first 2 seconds of flow. And we will probably publish this later this year.
Wow. Can't wait to.
And by the way, one of the things that gave us a toehold, you'll like this because it comes right out of your work, is we started to realize that flow was the opposite of traumatic stress. So if traumatic stress is what produces post-traumatic stress disorder, right?
I'd love to hear this.
We started to realize that the initial amount of information coming into the brain in a traumatic stress response or a flow response was the same. It's a burst of information that the brain goes, holy crap, really important. And if you can handle it really well, you get flow. And if you can't handle it at all, you get trauma and PTSD. And that insight that I had is what gave us a toehold into this, because it allowed us to take all the trauma studies, which have been done, ad nauseum, and we have a really good sense of what happens in, every kind of trauma, all the way to like learned helplessness, right? So we could take this stuff and we could use its opposite as a way to start looking for the beginning of flow. Which was a really kind of useful methodology. It's been really fun. So I think that's the study that's most exciting to me of the work we're doing. But there's 9 other things. We've got an ongoing piece with Imperial College in London to measure the differences between flow and psychedelics as interventions, and to see if there's a correlation between set and setting, which is really important in how you experience a psychedelic, right? If you're doing psychedelic therapy, set and setting, what is your mindset and what is the environment, is really critical to getting the health outcome you want, basically. And we wanted to compare set and setting versus various flow triggers and see, is there overlap between these two experiences, and where are they the same and where are they different, which has been super fun too.
Fascinating. So much to unpack here. I'm going to try to get as much out of the suitcase as I possibly can. What you're saying in regards to the traumatic stress, that flow being the opposite of post-traumatic stress, would explain a lot on my personal journey, and really that on what has been the underlying question that has informed or has driven and inspired and motivated the last 5 years of my life, since I had that healing experience back. I remember the day, it was December 28th, 2014, almost 5 years ago, where I felt flow for the first time. I felt this profound healing after letting go of the childhood sexual trauma and some of these deep, heavy memories that I carried into adulthood. And since then, I've been just, this has been my big question, is like, how is that possible? A 35-year-old man who's got a beautiful family and wonderful friends. How is it that I feel this deep love and this profound flow for the first time in my life? This path, as we've talked about before, has led me to the service work with our war veterans that are struggling immensely with PTSD and dropping like flies to suicide. We've got 22 veterans that die by their own hand each day. That number is likely far greater. Doesn't include the so many of them that are stuck in self-abuse with the opioids and drinking and so on. And this lends for tremendous amount of hope.
I'll tell you something that I think is really cool. And I've said this, which is because our map is the map we're drawing, it's drawing on a couple of bits of research into fight or flight response and things that are like really new stuff, basically. But my point is, one of the things that I'm pretty sure of is that the backside of this, I was talking about a spin-off company, but I think the backside of this is going to lead to new drug targets for PTSD, actually new pharmacological interventions for PTSD, which I think is really interesting because some of the pathways that we're picking are unusual and slightly different, but I think there's a lot. I mean, there's a lot of work here. There's a lot of people paying attention to this stuff in a lot of smart ways, and we're moving fast, which is really cool. It definitely means that there's hope for a lot of these communities that I don't think really existed a couple of years ago. But the combination of kind of big data and brain and really powerful brain imaging has really given us a toehold into stuff that we've never had before, which is cool.
I love it. This is really, really, really exciting. The idea that, I've been beating this drum for a few years now, that the tremendous amount of opportunity that is in the hearts and minds of our war veterans that are struggling with PTSD. If we could just get them the medicines that work so they can heal the trauma, cry those tears, purge the trauma, have those tough conversations that have their nervous systems all garbled up, that we could unearth or uncover a tremendous resource that if we earnestly seek peace in this lifetime, I don't think there's any way around it. We have to heal the hearts and minds of our war veterans. They can teach us all of these profound lessons that we're ignoring as a culture. And I talk about this in Worth the Fight, the systematic child sex abuse that the church perpetuates, the role that Big Pharma has in this. We have some of our war veterans are taking cocktails of 30 to 40 pills per day. And this opioid crisis is a mess that is something that we're all aware of. 193 people die to the opioid crisis every single day. That's 70,000 people per year. It was only 50,000 that died in all of the Vietnam conflict.
Those are big numbers. You're focused on a very specific patient population. And the truth of the matter, I'll be the first to admit it. I'm super grateful for folks like you because I'm focused on the puzzle, man. I'm in it for the actual mystery of the science. I always say that my altruism is about animals. People are not all that interesting to me. I want to make the world a better place for animals. I'm in flow for the puzzle, man. That's which means, right? And I'm in flow because I think that the world is up against massive environmental challenges that flow can help solve.
Yes,
right?
Amen to that.
For sure. In a lot of different ways. But I'm really grateful for folks like you because you're working with distinct patient populations. And one thing I want to just point out, don't sleep on this, because I think this is just as big of a problem as the one you're looking at, which is reintegrating our veterans after their service into society is the same problem, by the way, that I see in professional athletes, especially professional action sport athletes. Anybody who's in a job that produces a lot of flow and they're transitioning back into civilian life one way or another, and that life produces a lot less flow, that is cause of a lot of depression. And possibly it doesn't get as disastrous as the depression where there's PTSD layered in and you get so many, downstream factors, but it's serious all the same. And the same techniques that are going to be effective against PTSD are also going to be effective in this transition, I believe. And I think that's what the research shows.
Yeah, that's so true. What comes to mind for me is Sebastian Junger has got a profound book, Tribe, where he
Tribe. I know Sebastian a little bit, and I like that book. We were actually funny thing. Sebastian, it never happened. Sebastian, myself, we were trying to get Naval Hariri and Rich Diviney, who's the Navy SEAL who opened Stealing Fire, the four of us were going to do something on stage together on flow and war. Yuval Harari, who wrote Sapiens and Homo Deus, actually wrote a paper, I want to say back in 2008, might be even earlier, on flow and war. And he's not the only person who's worked on this topic, but he's probably the only person in 50 years. It's really interesting. I will tell you, if you go into the really early flow literature, like in motivation theory and like 50s and 60s, before Csikszentmihalyi really does his work, people are, Maslow was looking at peak experiences, and we're not really calling it flow yet. Tons of the work was done on soldiers. And one of the things that I think is really interesting is something happens culturally between World War I and World War II when you have flow, war is producing flow very frequently, and you're getting and the flow being produced by war seems to be a protection against the traumas of war. Not surprising. And then it starts to go away when we get to Korea and Vietnam, and is almost completely gone now unless you start talking to spec ops, which is really interesting. It has something we know, and that this is where Csikszentmihalyi did this work back in the 70s, and talked about this. But culture plays a huge role on how our ability to get into flow and how we can harness the flow's triggers, and specifically on the challenge skills balance, which is flow's most important trigger, and how we interpret challenge also has something to do with our culture, which is interesting.
Wow, so much there. So an important part of the worth the fight messaging, and this is a conversation that I don't really hear anybody else having, is the tie between this pervasive childhood sexual trauma that we have in our society that affects 1 in 5 of us, and war. Sebastian Junger, we just mentioned, he has some research, or in the book Tribe, he cites some that he quotes in quote unquote disturbing findings, where that the veterans that fought in our modern day wars, Iraq and Afghanistan, were 2 times more likely to have been subjected to childhood sexual trauma in the early years of childhood development than those that fought at random in Vietnam. And what we found with extensive, we're talking sample sets in the many hundreds, that it is a very high disproportionate amount of our war veterans, it's the childhood sexual trauma that is at root. They're coming in to address the PTSD symptoms, but at the root with the deep psychedelic healing, which, as you know from writing books about this, it cuts through all the bullshit and goes right to the root. These powerful medicines, especially ayahuasca, in that supported, ritualized container where people can really dig in a safe place. What are your thoughts on that? Something that I haven't been able to shake, this idea that this trauma and this unchecked sex abuse is essentially driving and perpetuating war.
I have no idea. I mean, that is so, you've gone leaps and bounds beyond my lane. I really have no idea. I mean, for starters, I work on the upper end of the spectrum. A friend of mine, a very dear friend of mine, just came to me with a bunch of depression questions. And I passed her along to the psychologists who work for me and are my coaches, because it's not where I put my attention. So I'm really hesitant to talk about this stuff, and how this stuff plays out culturally over time is a totally just different question. It's just outside of what I do and what I have any ability to comment on. Though the only thing I do want to say is everybody's got their shit. True. It is just hard here. It is, no one here gets out alive, and it's not easy. And, and one of the things, I have spent my career basically studying those moments in time when the impossible becomes possible, which has allowed me to meet leaders in pretty much every field you could possibly imagine. And at every level you could, movie stars, presidents, king, you know what I mean? Along the way, I've gotten to meet everybody, which has been fantastic. And I have not yet found anybody who is having an easy time here. I really haven't. It's hard here for all of us. And what happened in your childhood that we can put a label on and call it X versus something that we don't yet have a label. You know what I mean? Like, I just think it's hard here for everyone. That's about as far as I can take it. You know what I mean? So I don't try to, when it comes to like those kinds of causal links, framing plays such a huge role, right? I mean, this is what we learned from Viktor Frankl. If you can be in a concentration camp and yet feel that the horrible things that you're being forced to do are things that you're choosing to do by your own volition, you can reframe the horrors of a concentration camp and come out and find the experience was meaningful and rewarding, right? That's what he taught us. And, the point is less about the trauma and more about the frame we choose to build around it.
Beautifully said, and I respect your candor to not.
I just don't. I one of the most impressive things I ever saw. I was lucky enough. This was about 4 or 5 years ago. I got to do an event with Dr. Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel laureate psychologist. We were on stage, and it was a very high-powered audience, fancy audience, the kind of audience where you don't want to look dumb in front of them, and a woman gets up afterwards, and she obviously doesn't know what kind of psychologist Daniel Kahneman is. I don't know how she ended up in the room, but she doesn't know that he's basically spent his entire life working out of economics. But so she stands up and she tells this horrific story about her brother, who's a soldier, who has PTSD, who has now descended in all kinds of psychological hell and drug addiction, and crazy question, hard question. And afterwards, and she looks at, and like, turning to this guy for help. And he looks at her afterwards and goes, "Lady, I'm not that kind of psychologist, and I try to stay in my lane." And I figure if that's a Nobel laureate and, one of the smartest guys on the planet, if that's how he's going to respond, it is certainly my duty to respond that way, I think.
That's powerful, because I think a lot of people are speaking.
Right. It would be hard.
That they don't.
I got to tell you something. If I was the guy on the other end of the question, right? Like, if it was coming at me, if she was asking me, I don't think I would have been that brave at that moment in that room. I think I probably would have cobbled together some kind of answer. I would have hedged my bets and said, look, I'm not an expert here and blah, blah, blah. But I don't know if I could have just walked away in that way. I thought it was really brave.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. That's a beautiful lesson for us all to not go into those waters. I want to backtrack a little bit. You had mentioned some work being done at Imperial College of London. And this notion, the idea that the fMRI, and you write about this in Stealing Fire, and you mention it as well in Mapping Cloud 9, but the shared neurochemistry, or the similarities in shared neurochemistry between peak psychedelic experience, peak meditative experiences, and peak flow states. Can you talk a little bit about that? I think that is really profound.
For sure. Yeah, and you actually, and I don't mean to do this, I apologize for what's about to come out of my mouth. It's shared neurobiology. The neurochemistry, which is a component of the neurobiology, is actually a little different in all three of these experiences. But the point we made is that, so I guess the way to think about this is when you want to talk about what's going on in the brain, right? When scientists talk about what's going on in the brain, they're really talking about two categories of things, four things total in two categories. One is, how does the brain communicate with itself and with the body, right? That's neuroelectricity and neurochemistry. Those are just fancy terms for signaling in the brain and the body, right? How does the brain have conversations? How does it tell various things to do various things? And by the way, the brain does this through chemical signals and electrical signals, and 90% of all those signals are literally do more of something or do less of something, right? That's really what's going on. The other two things are neural anatomy and networks, which are where in the brain things are taking place, right? Neural anatomy, people tend to talk about specific structures. The amygdala does threat detection. But now we know that's not true. We actually know that the threat detection is a system. It's a network, right? And it's a fear system and blah, blah, blah. So the point is that neural anatomy and networks, where things are taking place, they rarely happen in one place. We tend to see networks, but the individual structures are names. What we found is in that most of it's not just flow, psychedelics, and meditation. It's the entire sort of raft of so-called spiritual experiences, from out-of-body experiences, near-death experiences, speaking in tongues, trance states, all kinds of various different meditative states, et cetera, et cetera. So it's this entire, all the experiences that I like to say are north of happy. And they all share very similar overlap in that in all these experiences, we see large portions of the prefrontal cortex deactivate. We see brain waves move from beta, normal waking consciousness, down to the alpha theta borderline, which we only are usually at like in REM sleep kind of thing. And we see changes in neurochemistry. And in a lot of these states, the changes in neurochemistry are very, very different. So, for example, most of the so-called psychedelic states are very heavily influenced by serotonin. There are, like, they also have dopamine and norepinephrine, which show up in flow. But if flow and serotonin is a very peculiar thing, the neurochemical is there at the very front end of the experience and possibly the very back end of the experience, but everything in the middle is totally serotonin free and dopamine heavy. And dopamine and serotonin tend to work antagonistically. So one's in our system, the other one's not in our system. So there are differences, and they're peculiar and sort of fun. I'll give you one example. So in meditation, there's a part of your brain right behind the center of your forehead known as the medial prefrontal cortex, the middle of the prefrontal cortex, and it shuts down. It's a part of your brain that does creative self-expression, right? It finds creative solutions to problems, that sort of thing. In meditation, when you're trying to make the self disappear, you don't need to express yourself creatively. So this portion of the brain totally deactivated. In flow, because flow is nothing but creative self-expression, it's hyperactive. So there are subtle differences that lead to profound changes in effect. But I will tell you, and this is directly out of the Imperial study, that when you if you map experiences possible in a psychedelic state versus in a flow state, and the map that we drew, right, the experiences that we were looking at ranged all the way from like feelings of peace, love, and unity through anxiety, visuals, spiritual experiences, synesthesia, where your senses cross over, out-of-body experiences, imagination, insight, fluid and connective thinking, cognitive difficulty. Like, we looked at a whole slew of things. And interestingly, while psychedelics will give you obviously more visuals and more spiritual experience, so-called, and more synesthesia, everything else basically maps on it. So if you're looking for a tool for peace, love, and unity in your life, or fluid and connective thinking, or imagination and insight and creativity, like those sorts of things, flow and psychedelics actually work the same. And the other thing, there's a flip side to this that I think is also really interesting, which is we also measured what a bad trip is like compared to people not being able to get into flow in terms of cognitive difficulties and anxiety and things like that. And we see the pain of a bad trip exceeds the pain of not getting into flow, but not a whole lot. They're sort of right there. There's more anxiety in a bad trip than in not getting into flow, though I think that's because they're not measuring in me when I'm having a writing crisis, but that's besides the point.
Wow. Love this. Love this. This has been a driving curiosity for me, having shifted. You know, I had a profound moment in 2015 when I was writing Worth the Fight, and I was looking for my next. It was about that time where I was to start planning my next psychedelic adventure and going out of the country to Costa Rica or Peru, and there was this profound moment of clarity where I had this realization that I was getting into flow with my work, and after 2 or 3 or 4 months after we had met in April of 2018 for the Flow for Writers workshop that you put on, which was amazing. Thank you again for that. And finding flow was so deeply the actual of writing my book and committing to getting into this state as often as I could to get this book done was one of the most therapeutic experiences that I've ever had in my life.
Let me ask you a question, by the way. I'll bet your desire to do psychedelics or your need to do psychedelics massively decreased on the back end of that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
We see, it's interesting. I'm not a huge fan of psychedelics, mostly because I think like they're not an action state. It's like I can't take mushrooms and write a book, right? Like I have to take mushrooms and I go on a vacation. And while I find the reset can be powerful, I also find it's a day-long experience. It usually costs me 2 days on the back end, and I don't have 3 days worth of time to not be at my best and to take that away from my work. But I do find, and I think your experience is absolutely correct, I think psychedelics can be very, very useful. And we've seen this in the studies when you're trying to sort of get back to normal, sort of reset from trauma, right? And once that happens, I think if you keep going back to psychedelics to try to find flow, you're going to cause yourself problems in your life. I think like once you've got that reset, you want to switch towards flow, because flow is very sustainable over time. Psychedelic practices are not.
Yeah, that resonates completely with my personal experience. And yeah, going back to the well continuously, when the information that I had, it was about the action, like you had said, putting these insights, putting the lessons into.
I got to tell you something. People talk about psychedelics and the big benefit being, I get all these visions and insights while I'm actually tripping. And maybe that's the case. Maybe that's actually a real thing for people in a way that I don't quite understand. Okay, fair enough. But I think one of the giant advantages that these chemicals are actually doing is the fact that they destroy us afterwards. So that you have a day afterwards where you absolutely have to shut it down, and you're recovering from a psychedelic experience, so you don't really take your emotions and all that stuff super seriously, right? You're really, it's a recovery, it's a total recovery day, it's a total shutdown day. And I think we get that so rarely in this world that is as profound, if not more profound, than anything that's happening when the substance is in your system. And I don't think we notice it because we feel like it feels like a hangover. It is a hangover, but the shutdown you get with that hangover is so complete. And there's enough of that, like there's usually enough residual feel good something in your system that you're a little less negative during that recovery period also. And I think that's really, really important and really profound. And I also think, by the way, it means that if, for people who are doing like, a bunch of experiences right in a row, I'm not so sure the system works that way though.
And you talk about that extensively. What's coming to mind for me is the recovery stage of the flow cycle and the importance of that we can't always be in flow, and sitting with these challenging days where we're not our best, but weathering the storm. And I agree that some of those profound lessons of the fallout after these peak experiences in some way has prepared me to honor that aspect of the flow cycle and to weather that storm.
I think you have to weather that storm. I mean, the recovery period is mandatory, and if you don't honor it, you're just going to get burned out. I mean, it's just a recipe for burnout. You know what I mean? Like forget everything. In best case scenario, depression. In worst case scenarios, right? Edith Maslow pointed out years and years ago, in the 50s, that frequent access to flow prevents suicide. What he didn't say, but it's the obvious inverse, is not getting access to flow, right? Not recovering, not being able to restart the flow cycle, and getting locked out of flow probably causes suicide.
Yeah.
Right. That's why, by the way, when I talked about dealing with veterans without PTSD who are trying to come from a high flow job to a low flow life, right, is tricky for a lot of those same reasons.
Powerful. Well, I want to end this on and share this incredible optimism. I love the line. This totally resonates, and it, like when I first heard you say this in Mapping Cloud 9, it got a visceral response from me. It's abundance or bust. That it's kind of that now or never spirit. That it's game time for us. We have the tools, and we're understanding more about, I think Jim Quick says this, that we've learned more about the human brain in the last 10 to 20 years than we have in the previous 2000 combined. And you talk about the excitement of biotech, growing 5 times the speed of Moore's law, which is just, it's insane to wrap our hands around what that means. Why are you so optimistic and about these tools, flow states, meditation, psychedelics, if used responsibly, can be used for tackling some of those grand challenges?
Well, there's a lot of different reasons, but the easiest, most straight ahead one. And so I have a new book coming out in 3 weeks called The Future is Faster Than You Think, co-written with Peter Diamandis. It's the third in the series of Abundance and Bold. And let's just say the future is faster than you think. Let's just say that, and let's say that I prove it in the book. And let's just so the number I want to put in your head, because it's the craziest thing. And this is not my work. This is Ray Kurzweil's, but I want to put it in context for people. So Ray Kurzweil, who mapped the speed of all these accelerating technologies. And so he came up with, how do you map exponential growth in technologies? And so when you say biotech is moving at 5 times the speed of Moore's law, that's the Carlson curve, named after a guy named Rob Carlson, who was actually, at the time, he was measuring the speed of genomic sequencing, improvements in genomics specifically, but it extends to most of biotech. So he mapped all this out. And what he figured out is that over the next 81 years, by the end of the century, we are going to experience 20,000 years worth of technological change. So let me put that in context for you. It means in 81 years, we're going to go birth of agriculture to the Industrial Revolution twice. It means in the next 10 years, we're going to experience probably 100 years of technological change. So think about the world in 1919 and think about the world today, and then think about 2020 to 2030, and that's what we're looking at, right? A massive amount of acceleration. So here's the issue. The brain cannot process information at this speed nor this scale. The human brain evolved in environments that are local and linear. Local, everything was close by. Linear, rate of change was really slow. I mean, generation to generation to generation, nothing changed. Forget about month to month, right? So today, we live in a world that's global and exponential, and the brain literally cannot process this speed or this scale. It can't perform at speed or at scale. Flow is the only time we can. In flow, all of the brain's information processing machinery is massively amplified for a variety of neurobiological reasons. We take in more information per second, we process it more completely and process it more deeply. And as a result, we see all kinds of upticks in performance and motivation and productivity and creativity and innovation and learning rates. All the things you need to keep pace in an accelerated world show up in flow. Even better, and here's the craziest part. If I say, Matt, close your eyes and imagine, do this. Close your eyes and imagine the person you're going to be in 10 years. Just imagine what you're wearing and where you are and maybe what you're eating or what's in your pocket. Did you do that?
I did.
Okay. So here's something crazy. Remember earlier I talked about the medial prefrontal cortex, the part of our brain that does creative self-expression? Mm-hmm. It's a very selfish part of our brain. So when you think about yourself, it lights up. When you think about other people, it deactivates. And if you think about like loved ones, it deactivates a little. And if you think about acquaintances a little more, and total strangers, it's just shut the fuck down. So I asked you to think about yourself 10 years from now. Well, I'm asking you to think about yourself. You would think that this part of your brain lights up. It doesn't. It actually shuts down. The brain treats the person we're going to become as an absolute stranger. This is why, for example, people have a really difficult time staying on diets or, going to a 4-year university program or getting a prostate exam or saving for retirement. The person who's going to benefit from those efforts is not actually you. And the brain treats that person as a stranger. So it's really hard. We have to overcome all that barrier.
Unless you're in flow, right?
Because that part of the brain stays hyperactive when we think into the future. So you've talked about, you mentioned it earlier, you get vision and intuition and insight in flow about possibilities in your life, right? Mm-hmm. This is why. It's parts of yourself are shut down, but you can actually see clearly into the future in a way that you cannot under any other condition, which is crazy, but true. And by the way, let's not kid ourselves. Evolution shaped the brain to use flow to perform at its best. Primarily, we only do two things in this world to survive. We exploit resources, or we explore and find new resources. So, right, anything that helps us exploit or explore, which flow does, gets amplified. And this means innovation goes way up. And so the very thing we need to keep pace with the future, the very thing we need to innovate our way out of the problems we're in, this is what flow brings to the table. And I always say that if you look at history, if you look at the spots where I've spent my career playing and looking and studying where impossible becomes possible, right? And this isn't rare. The impossible becomes possible all the frickin' time. We call it history, right? But it's, the 4-minute mile was a miracle until it became the standard of excellence among runners, right? And now it's just, if you don't run a 4-minute mile, you're not going to compete at the world-class stage. It's just what you do. Right? But it used to be a miracle. It used to be impossible. History is littered with this stuff, but every time you see it, you see the same things. You see people harnessing, accelerating disruptive technology and finding ways to extend human capability. It's always those two things coming together. So we've got, and this is what the Future and Faster Than You Think talks about, the most potent technology the world has ever seen at our disposal. And when I say at our disposal, what I literally mean is all of this fancy, crazy tech that's coming, that's accelerating our future, has user-friendly interfaces. And the funny example I like to give is quantum computing. And when I first heard about quantum computing in the 90s, it was the biggest fairy tale. It was so sci-fi that even me, a guy who was tracking impossibles, I was like, fuck it, I'm not tracking that. That's just too crazy. Not only is quantum computing here, meaning Google just announced they achieved quantum supremacy. So we've got a quantum computer that's as powerful as regular computers. And Intel just announced we're going to have quantum computing chips in their next generation smartphone chip. So it's going to the mainstream. You can go to Rigetti.com. Rigetti is a quantum computer manufacturer. You can download something called Forest that is a user-friendly interface to the quantum world. It means, Matt, if you want to run data analysis on trauma and flow on a quantum computer, you can do it. And it's so easy to use. Over 1 million programs have been run. So when I say we have access to the most powerful technology we've ever seen, we have access to the most powerful technology we've ever seen. And we have access to states of consciousness that are more powerful than anything else we can achieve. And we've got them both at the same time. So how could you not be hopeful?
Love it. And like we've been talking, there's immense grand challenges that are in front of us. We have the climate crisis that, is something that's on all of our radars right now. The political challenges. We have all sorts of challenges that we have as a people right now. And to think that these tools and this understanding are coming online at the perfect time to help us level up as a people is really exciting. And
it is exciting.
That's why this abundance or bust gives me this visceral response.
I think Peter and I, when we wrote Abundance, that was people always ask, are we techno optimists, right? Do we think technology alone gets this done, right? And our answer is no. Our answer in that book is, hey, we've got the most potent technology we've ever seen, and it is allowing, for the first time in history, individuals and small teams to tackle grand global challenges and win, right? Places that governments were failing 20 years ago, you've got individuals winning. We've never seen anything like that. That's what technology gives us. But to pull this off, to actually create a world of abundance, right? And when we say abundance, we don't mean everybody gets a Mercedes and a closet full of Armani. We mean that you can meet and exceed the basic needs of every man, woman, and child on the planet. And I would also say take care of plants, animals, and ecosystems. I think it's both, if you're really going to talk about abundance. But we can do it, but it's going to take the largest cooperative effort in history. It is all of us working together, and it's all of us in flow at our best working together. That's the only way we get this done. And when we say abundance or bust, we mean either we get this done or our species goes away. So very, very hopeful, but there's a clock, and it's ticking, I think.
Wow. I'm in on all this. So, and I appreciate you articulating that. I was going to ask for any closing inspiration, thoughts, and remarks, but I think you absolutely fucking nailed that. And where can people find you? And any closing remarks of inspiration?
Yeah. So you can find me at stephenkotler.com. You can find, if you're interested in more flow in your life, you can go to theflowresearchcollective.com. And if you go to zerotodangerous.com, that's our big flow training at the Flow Research Collective. You just sign up and spend an hour on a call with one of our peak performance specialists who will just sort of talk you through your life and see what challenges you're up and see if there's any overlap between what we do and what you need. And that's totally free if you want. So all those places. And if you're more interested in all that stuff, there's so much free content at both stephenkotler.com and flowresearchcollective.com. You could spend, weeks just sort of wading through free stuff. And, if you're just because I'll get killed if I don't, futurefasterbook.com is the website for the new book with Peter Diamandis and myself. And we are book doesn't launch till January 28th. We've got a huge kind of pre-order contest going on right now with lots of free giveaways. So if you go to futurefasterbook.com and pre-order, that way you get entered to win. Lots of cool stuff. And I'm done with the advertisement for Stephen's stuff. How'd we do?
Amazing. And I just wanted to put out there that you have a lifetime invitation, an open-ended invitation. Anytime you want to come on the Worth the Fight podcast, love to share Future Faster. Can't wait to dive into that as well. And thank you so much for sharing your gifts and for being the pace car to follow and for walking this path with integrity. I remember the day back in 2017 when I first heard of your work on the James Altucher podcast. It was you and Jamie Wheal were spitting some high vibe truth, and it resonated and caught me at a time in my life where I was in this vulnerable state looking for direction. And your work has had such a profound impact on my journey in better understanding my healing and better understanding what this human experience is about, which has ultimately led me to a path of service. And, again, I just am so unbelievably grateful for your work, and thank you for taking this time to share your work. And I can't wait to absorb more of your content and high vibe inspiration in the months and years to come.
Matt, thank you. I appreciate that. I appreciate you, and I appreciate what you do. I meant what I said earlier. We desperately need people like you working on this end of the problem, because I'm certainly not, and it's a big world.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for those words.
Thank you, man. Be good.
All the best. Thank you.
Abundance or bust. I love this. During that inspired conversation with Stephen, we talked a bit about our war veterans that are struggling in the midst of a mental health care crisis. I'd love to plug the Heroic Hearts Project. I talk more about this incredible organization in Worth the Fight podcast episode number 3 with Jesse Gold. We dive in deep to this veteran collective soul healing mission. You can find more about this vital work at heroicheartsproject.org. We are seeking financial assistance and motivated volunteers that believe in this service project, helping our war veterans that are in the midst of a mental health crisis get access to ayahuasca healing retreats, the support, both the integration support on the front end and on the back end of this project. We're seeing incredible results. We'd love your help. Please reach out if you got any questions. Thank you so much for listening. This has been Matt Simpson of the Worth the Fight podcast. Thank you so much for listening. You can learn more about our mission of hope and healing at worththefightbook.org. Please rate, review, and share this episode. Please help us expand our circle of influence and get these vital conversations out to our human family. Also, if you are in a financial position to support the show, you can help us push forward these conversations with monthly donations on Patreon. This podcast is a tremendous amount of work for me, and I have stellar guests in the queue. Please help if you can. Thank you for listening to this programming. Much love, y'all. Peace.